The Winter War by Priscilla Shirer with Gina Detweiler. Chapter 23. The Rock. Evan walked down to the pond and sat on the dock, dangling his legs over the side. He had never seen the pond frozen before. It looked like a giant skating rink. He was tempted to try it out, but his mom had forbidden him to step on the ice. It wasn't safe, she said. He remembered the time he was scared of jumping into this pond because of the sea monster he was certain lived under the water. That was more than 2 years ago, before he had ridden a dragon through the skies of Ahortoz, before he had helped save a prisoner from Skatos and saved the rec center from an Ent invasion and all the other things he had done that were pretty cool. And yet everyone thought his idea about capturing the Olathron was stupid. They wouldn't even listen to him. His own brother just made fun of him. And Ruach had given him a plain old rock. Evan took the rock out of his pocket and looked at it for a long time. He had hoped by now it would have turned into something else, like the Chris that changed into a sword or the seed that turned into a shield. He had tried throwing it in the air and rolling it on the ground. He had put it underwater and even held it to a candle flame to see if he could make out invisible messages. Yet this rock was still just a rock. Maybe I'm just as useless as this rock, he thought, just like Xavier said. Sometimes I feel useless. Evan was tempted to throw it away. He wondered what would happen if he threw it at the icy pond. Would it break right through and sink? But he had done that with the seed when he thought it was good for nothing. That turned out to be the wrong move. He turned the rock over in his hand. There had to be something that made this rock special. The rock was very smooth. It fit into his palm perfectly. In fact, it was kind of nice to hold. He gripped it tightly. It felt warm in his hand, which was getting pretty cold. He should have worn mittens. Evan shivered. He got up and headed back to the house, putting the rock in his pocket. He walked through the fresh snow so he could make new tracks and was surprised at how deep it was. With each step, his feet sank almost to the knees. He had to jump to make any progress. Suddenly he felt something behind him and stopped, frozen. He spun around to face the woods at the edge of his yard. There was nothing there. But the nothing felt real to him. A nothing that was more than nothing. He could smell it too. That scent of something rotting. It was there. The empty. Evan gripped the rock in his pocket and trudged toward the woods. He had to see this thing, whatever it was or wasn't. For some reason, he didn't feel scared, only curious. He walked into the wooded area and stopped to look around. The snow wasn't as deep here, as much of it had fallen into the trees above. Sunlight filtered in from the branches, casting strange shadows on the snow. But none of those shadows was the shadow. Maybe he had been mistaken. Maybe the empty was really empty after all. A branch above his head rustled. He looked up and saw a large white bird sitting there. He almost gasped out loud. It was the exact same bird he'd seen in the scary forest in the in-between. It had to be. The majestic bird sat very still and stared at him as if waiting for him to make a move. Evan felt his heart beating wildly. He took a step toward the bird. It suddenly spread its wings and took off, nearly knocking him over with surprise. It flew a short distance and then settled on another tree branch, just like before. Evan had the distinct impression that he was supposed to follow it. He took a few steps toward the bird, and it took off again, landing a little farther away. It was going deeper into the woods. Evan got worried. What if I get lost? But he continued to plod through the snow, following the bird. And then he heard a sound. It was a very small sound, a tiny squeak, coming from farther ahead in the woods, like an animal in trouble. The bird took off again, flying a little farther. As Evan raced to catch up, he heard the animal noise even louder, a crying, whining sound. The bird flew out the other side of the trees and into an open area, which was actually the backyard of a house. The whining noise was even more pronounced. Evan started to run, leaping through the snow. His heart pounded 1,000,000 miles a minute. His chest tightened, making it harder to breathe. He ran toward the small ranch house sitting on a little rise in the distance. Snow was piled up high all around the house. He couldn't see any movement, but he could still hear the whining. As he approached the house, the snow was so deep, he practically had to tunnel through it. Finally, Evan saw a tiny furry head appear from the top of the snow at the bottom of a deck at the back of the house. He took a breath, somewhat relieved. The little dog must be stuck, and no one could hear his cries for help. But who would let a tiny dog like that out all alone? The dog saw Evan and started to yip frantically. Evan trudged toward it, calling out, "Take it easy, I'm coming," as he went. Then he saw something pink in the snow. Pink was not a color that belonged in the snow. He took a few more steps and stopped, gasping. An elderly woman was lying half buried, wearing a pink robe and slippers. Evan rushed toward her. Ma'am, are you okay?" He brushed the snow off the woman and shook her shoulders. She started to move a little bit, moaning. Evan was thankful that she was alive. The dog barked like crazy, its high-pitched yap making Evan's ears hurt. Evan wasn't sure what to do. Go and get help? But if the lady lay out here in the cold any longer, she might die. He summoned all his strength, grabbed her under her arms, and dragged her, inch by inch, toward the porch steps, all the while talking to her. "I've got you, ma'am. Don't worry." He managed to get her only halfway out of the snow, lying across the porch steps. He stopped, exhausted, took off his coat, and threw it over her body. "I'm going to go inside and call my parents, okay? Don't worry. Everything will be fine," the woman moaned a reply. Evan stumbled into the house, saw the old-fashioned corded phone on the wall, and picked up the receiver. His hands were shaking so badly from cold and fear that it took him a while to dial his house number. His mom answered. The words rushed out of Evan's mouth in an unbroken stream. "Mom, a old lady fell in the snow and she's half frozen and I can't get her out. Please come and help." "Evan, slow down. Who is it?" "I don't know. Other side of the woods. She has a little dog. I heard it crying." "Oh no, it must be Mrs. Johnson. I'll call 911. You stay with her and try to keep her warm until we get there." Evan hung up and grabbed some old Afghans from the living room sofa and rushed back outside again. He brushed the snow off Mrs. Johnson and wrapped her as best he could in the blankets. She was shivering. Her lips were blue. The dog lay down at her side, whining and licking her hand. "They're coming, Mrs. Johnson. They're coming. Don't worry." Evan spoke the words over and over. Then he thought of the rock. He pulled it out of his pocket and looked at it. Suddenly, he recalled Ruach's words, stone of remembrance. "Ruach," he said aloud, holding on to the rock, "please help make Mrs. Johnson okay." The rock was really warm from having been in his pocket. He placed the rock in the old woman's hand under the blanket. He closed her fingers over it. As he did, her shivering subsided, and she stopped moaning. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Her lips moved slightly, mouthing the words, "Thank you." An ambulance and a police car arrived in a few minutes, along with his mom. The paramedics lifted the old lady onto a stretcher and brought her into the house, where they proceeded to check her vitals and warm her up. They announced that she was okay, no broken bones. They were pretty sure she didn't have any frostbite either. "It's a good thing you found her when you did," one of them told Evan. "If she had lain out there any longer, we might have lost her." Mrs. Johnson managed to tell them that she had taken her little dog, Bentley, out to do his business, but missed her footing and fell off the deck into the snow. She couldn't get up because it was too deep. "How is Bentley?" she asked in a thin trickle of a voice. "He's okay," said Evan, who had wrapped the dog in 2 blankets. "Thank goodness," she said. "Thank goodness you came when you did. How did you know to find me?" "How did you find her?" his mom asked. "Her house is over a half-mile from ours." "I heard the dog crying," Evan said with a shrug. "He's got a pretty loud cry." His mom looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she just smiled and hugged him. "I am so proud of you, Evan." "We'll need to take you to the hospital for observation," one of the paramedics said. "My Bentley!" "Don't worry, Mrs. Johnson. We'll take care of him until you're well again," said Evan's mom. Evan glanced up at her and smiled. "Oh, thank you. His food is under the sink. He takes a half a cup in the morning and evening, mixed with a little applesauce for his digestion." Mrs. Johnson was already sounding better. "And make sure to take his favorite pillow. He won't sleep at night without his pillow." "Got it," said Evan, cuddling the little dog so the old lady would know he would take good care of him. Before the paramedics rolled her out to the ambulance, Mrs. Johnson held out her hand to Evan. It contained the rock. "Thank you," she whispered. Evan took the rock, smiling at her. "What is that?" asked his mom. "Oh, just a rock," said Evan. But he was pretty sure now that this little rock wasn't just a rock after all.